You tell yourself that you walked away, yet your mind still returns to them in the quiet moments, and that contradiction is the first sign that something deeper is operating beneath your awareness. You removed your body, but your nervous system did not receive the message. You changed your environment, but your internal state is still calibrated to their presence. That is the unsettling truth about trauma bonds. They do not live in proximity, they live in conditioning. You are not struggling because you lack discipline. You are struggling because your brain was trained to associate emotional volatility with connection, and once that association forms, it does not dissolve simply because you decided it should. A trauma bond is not sustained by love. It is sustained by unpredictability. When affection is given and withdrawn in irregular intervals, your nervous system enters a heightened state of alertness, and that heightened state begins to feel like aliveness. The cycle of tension and relief releases chemicals that reinforce attachment far more powerfully than steady affection ever could. You were not addicted to the person. You were conditioned by the rhythm of reward and loss, by the oscillation between hope and fear, by the moments of warmth that arrived just after emotional distance. Your body learned that closeness required anxiety, and so anxiety began to feel like intimacy. That is why you can recognize the damage intellectually and still feel pulled back emotionally. Cognition and conditioning are not the same system. One analyzes, the other reacts. And when those systems conflict, the nervous system usually wins. You may tell yourself that you miss them, but what you often miss is the intensity, the sense of being consumed, the sharpness of anticipation before they responded, the relief when they finally did. In consistent relationships, there is stability. In trauma bonds, there is suspense. Suspense stimulates vigilance, and vigilance creates attachment because your brain equates focus with importance. The more uncertain you felt, the more you fixated. The more you fixated, the more significant they seemed. Over time, your identity quietly reorganized around managing the emotional climate between you. You began scanning for shifts in tone, changes in energy, subtle withdrawals. That scanning became habitual. Even now, long after the separation, your body still searches for signals, still checks for updates, still replays conversations as if resolution might be hidden in some overlooked detail. This is not weakness, it is pattern continuation. When the cycle of intensity and absence repeats often enough, it merges pain with validation. You feel chosen when they return. You feel discarded when they withdraw. The contrast sharpens both experiences, and the sharpness convinces you that what you felt was profound. Depth, however, is not measured by emotional turbulence. It is measured by safety. And safety was not the defining feature of what you experienced. Trauma bonds thrive on emotional inconsistency because inconsistency forces pursuit. When attention is unpredictable, the mind assigns greater value to it. You began working harder for clarity, harder for reassurance, harder for emotional equilibrium. Without realizing it, you stepped into a chasing posture internally, even if you never expressed it externally. Your thoughts revolved around regaining balance, restoring connection, preventing the next withdrawal. That internal chasing erodes self-trust because your focus shifts from your own state to their responses. Over time, you stop asking whether you feel respected and start asking whether they are satisfied. This shift is subtle but profound. It is the moment power quietly transfers. Not because they demanded it, but because your nervous system feared loss more than it valued peace. Fear of loss activates survival circuits. When survival circuits are activated, clarity narrows. You tolerate behaviors that you would otherwise reject because the threat of abandonment feels larger than the cost of compromise. After separation, those survival circuits do not immediately deactivate. They continue firing as if the bond can still be restored. That is why no contact is psychologically necessary, not as punishment, not as strategy, but as neurological reset. Each exposure reactivates the cycle. Each glance at their profile reinforces the neural pathway that associates them with relief or pain. Healing requires starving that pathway until it weakens. The first phase feels empty because your system has lost its familiar stimulus. Calm may initially feel dull. even unsettling because your baseline was elevated by chaos. You mistake regulation for boredom. You mistake peace for absence. Yet what you are experiencing is recalibration. A regulated nervous system does not crave extremes. It tolerates steadiness. It recognizes consistency as security rather than monotony. This is where many men become confused. They interpret the absence of intensity as the absence of connection, and so they gravitate back toward what feels charged. Intensity is not evidence of compatibility. It is often evidence of unresolved patterns colliding. Trauma bonds frequently attach to pre-existing insecurities. If you entered the relationship with doubts about your worth, moments of validation from them felt amplified. If you feared being unseen, their attention felt intoxicating. The bond anchored itself to the part of you that longed to be affirmed. Breaking the bond, therefore, requires more than distancing from them. It requires confronting the insecurity that made their approval feel essential. This is where internal authority begins. When you can generate your own sense of worth, external inconsistency loses its leverage. When you are comfortable in silence, you no longer interpret distance as threat. When you trust your perception, you do not require repeated reassurance. The trauma bond dissolves as your dependence on external regulation decreases. This is not achieved through force. It is achieved through disciplined self-observation. Notice when your thoughts drift toward them. Notice what you are seeking in that moment. Is it comfort? Is it validation? Is it distraction from loneliness? The craving always points to an unmet internal need. Instead of pursuing the person who once temporarily satisfied that need, begin addressing the need directly. If you seek validation, build competence. If you seek reassurance, cultivate self-trust through consistent action. If you seek intensity, channel it into growth that challenges you without destabilizing you. Structure becomes powerful here. Routine anchors the nervous system. Predictability restores internal safety. Training your body, maintaining disciplined habits, protecting your sleep, and managing your attention are not superficial self-improvement tactics. They are neurological stabilization tools. Stability allows your mind to differentiate between attraction and activation. Attraction feels calm, curious, steady. Activation feels urgent, anxious, consuming. Trauma bonds are driven by activation. Healthy connection is sustained by steadiness. The more comfortable you become with steadiness, the less compelling activation appears. This transition requires patience because your brain will attempt to romanticize the past. It will highlight the peak moments while minimizing the volatility that surrounded them. Memory is selective when emotion is involved. You must consciously recall the full pattern, not just the highlights. Ask yourself whether you felt secure or vigilant. Ask whether your presence expanded or contracted. Ask whether your peace increased or deteriorated. These questions restore perspective. They interrupt nostalgia with accuracy. Closure does not arrive from their apology or recognition. Closure arrives when your internal narrative shifts from longing to understanding. You stop interpreting the bond as unfinished love and begin recognizing it as completed conditioning. The relationship fulfilled its psychological function by revealing where you were vulnerable. Once you extract that lesson, the attachment loosens because its purpose has been integrated. Future protection depends on discernment rather than suspicion. You do not guard your heart through paranoia. You guard it through standards anchored in emotional stability. If someone introduces inconsistency early, you withdraw calmly. If communication fluctuates dramatically, you disengage without drama. If affection feels intoxicating and overwhelming before trust is established, you slow down. The man who is grounded does not chase intensity. He observes patterns. He measures consistency. He chooses environments that reinforce his regulation rather than disrupt it. This is not detachment as avoidance. It is detachment as self-respect. You do not cling because you do not derive identity from being chosen. You do not over-explain because your clarity does not require negotiation. You remain steady because your internal state is not dependent on external fluctuation. Trauma bonds dissolve when you stop confusing emotional turbulence with depth. Depth is revealed in reliability, in measured responses, in calm presence. As your nervous system stabilizes, you will notice a shift. The urgency fades. The need to check diminishes. Thoughts arise without pulling you into rumination. This is the quiet evidence of healing. It does not announce itself dramatically. It appears in subtle reductions of emotional charge. Eventually, you recognize that the person who once dominated your attention no longer governs your state. That is the moment power returns fully to you. Not power over them, but power over your internal climate. You are no longer compelled. You are no longer waiting. You are no longer negotiating with memory. You are centered. The trauma bond taught you how easily your system can be conditioned by inconsistency. Breaking it teaches you how resilient you become when you choose stability. The lesson is not that love is dangerous. The lesson is that love without safety is destabilizing. When you internalize this distinction, you move differently. You select differently. You attach differently. You do not pursue what destabilizes you, no matter how magnetic it feels. You remain aligned with what preserves your clarity. In that alignment, attraction becomes choice rather than compulsion. Connection becomes mutual rather than consuming. And most importantly, your peace is no longer negotiable.